What's up, guys, and welcome back to the 7th episode of the Punch Pine podcast. And we're going to be starting off this podcast by talking about a potential matchup between Khamzat Chimaev and Gilbert Burns. To start this off, pretty much, Khamzat Chimaev and Gilbert Burns, it was kind of a leaked DM, I guess you could say, between them, where Gilbert Burns put in the DM saying April 9th, and Khamzat said, "Yes, brother, it's on." So hopefully this fight gets made into tuition, and I don't really see it being the first fight, or at least the next fight that the UFC and Dana White make for Khamzat Chimaev, as I feel like it's a huge leap in competition, especially
Yeah.
from Li Jing Leon and kind of Gilbert Burns. Like, Gilbert Burns is elite fighter. He gave Usman some troubles in their first round, and he's very talented, and his jiu-jitsu game is incredible. One of the world champion jiu-jitsu practitioners, and I feel like there should be a fight before, or maybe even two fights before
Yeah.
Gilbert Burns. And there's been guys like Bilal Muhammad and also Neil Magny who's been openly asking Hamza for a fight and has been adding the UFC and trying to make that happen. So first off, I don't know why he hasn't been booked yet. Like,
Yeah.
it's been especially for Hamza, and how many times he fought consecutively on Fight Island, and now just for him to not be booked in a while, it's just kind of weird. And I feel like they should be attempting to book him as fast as possible. And another reason why I don't think he should immediately fight Gilbert Burns next is just so he can gain some more experience.
Yeah, and I mean, from going from Li Jingliang, who was the 11th ranked contender, all the way to like the second ranked contender in Burns, whose only loss in the welterweight division was the champion, Kamaru Usman. So, like that's really fast tracking him if they're gonna put him up against Burns. But I mean, if they did, which it looks like they're agreeing on it verbally at least, so it's definitely possible for maybe UFC 273, which is on April 9th, but that card is already stacked with Petr Yan and Alexander Volkanovski both fighting on that card. So I'm not sure if this fight will happen. And as you said, it's weird that Khamzat's not booked yet because I mean you'd assume they'd book him already, but I don't know. There might be a reason as to why he's not booked. Maybe they want to get him against a certain person, and maybe that person is Gilbert Burns. So maybe there's a reason they want to do this. And I mean, considering how dominant Khamzat has been in his last couple of fights, we haven't really seen enough from him to like really like solidify the fact that he can beat Burns because Burns is so talented with like such an extensive Brazilian jiu-jitsu background and he's so talented on the feet and we just don't know how they would match up. So that's why it would make it such an interesting fight. But as you said, it's definitely a fast track for Kamza and I mean I guess it's possible, but it would be interesting to see this kind of fight and it would definitely be a great match to make. Both guys have such interesting styles, both so entertaining, and the build up to this fight would be amazing. And it would really, if he was able to beat Burns, it would really, really fast track him to a title shot against Kamaru Usman. I think that would probably be like his next fight if he were to beat Burns. And the same thing for Gilbert Burns. I mean, he'd probably get a rematch with Kamaru Usman if he was able to defeat Kamza. Maybe not immediately, but I think it would get him really close to it at least.
Yeah, it's definitely possible he could maybe not immediately, but it definitely could put him very close into that title
Yeah, especially
contention.
with the hype of Kamza and how that would like transfer into Gilbert Burns if you were to beat him.
Yeah, and but also I feel like that's another reason as why this fight doesn't really make sense all too much. Because let's say we remove the names from it and how much hype Hamza has been getting by destroying all these guys, and let's just put the facts on facts. And Hamza, it's only the 11th ranked welterweight right now, and Burns is coming off a win as well, and is the
Yeah,
second ranked welterweight in the world. And I feel like if he was coming off right off this loss of Usman, then maybe it would make more sense. But we gotta remember he's coming off a win off of Wonder Boy, who's also, even though he also lost to
lost to
Belil,
Bilal. Yeah.
but I feel like he's still good competition, as we know how amazing Wonder Boy is on the feet. So that's why I still feel like it's important that we don't rush Hamza too much, and don't and because you don't want to have one of those situations where we just, after one loss like that, by fast tracking him maybe to the title or to super high competition, it just ruins him, and just removes all that hype that he currently has, which is we haven't seen a hype like this in a very long time. And we want to make sure that it doesn't remove from his potential and his skill set.
Yeah, and I mean, but just Khamzat's dominance and his hype, as you said, it's just been unreal. And like the fact that he hasn't had a fight go longer than 2 rounds, to see that against like a veteran and such an experienced guy in Burns, who competed at both lightweight and welterweight, and has had great success so far in welterweight, beating Tyron Woodley and Damian Maia, and then Wonder Boy in July. So yeah, it would definitely be an interesting matchup. But I'm not sure if they should if they should rush him, if they should put this matchup right away, especially like when you consider like the likes of Darren Till, for example, who was rushed to an immediate title shot against Tyron Woodley and got flattened. So you don't really want to rush these guys, but at the same time, with Khamzat's dominance, it could be a possibility. But I think to build him up, they should probably put him against a Bilal Muhammad or a Neil Magny. And but they have verbally agreed, which I mean, if this fight happens, like we're not complaining, that's for sure.
Yeah,
We're gonna
definitely
be
not.
we're
Definitely
gonna
not.
be throwing some parties and
We're gonna have the popcorn out and just munching away.
yeah, we're gonna be hella excited. But to make the fight, it's gonna be interesting. But it's kind of rushing him into the toughest fights that they could possibly put. I mean, the top three guys: Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, and Gilbert Burns. So I mean, to
Killers,
put him
yeah.
up against those one of those three guys, and then potentially fast track him to Usman right away, while Usman's been so dominant and has obviously beaten everyone there is to beat in the division so far, and is potentially going to fight Leon Edwards for a second time this year. So
Yeah. And just kind of now more stylistically, a matchup, if it was to take place between Hamza Chimaev and Gilbert Burns, is a really interesting one because of
yeah,
Hamzat's very experienced freestyle wrestling past, as well with Gilbert Burns's super accomplished jiu-jitsu career. And that those matchups are always interesting, as I feel like Hamza will probably be able to take Gilbert down, even though it'll probably be tough. But the real question would be is how it would play out with Gilbert going for his submissions and all of his crafty skills on the ground, while Hamza's trying to smash him from there. But also another factor is if Gilbert wants to get this to the ground, which I'm not sure exactly if he will, because we know Hamza's ground game's elite already, but we don't know for sure exactly how amazing his striking is. Obviously, we know he has power. Knocking out Gerald Mearshart with one punch, maybe he'd rather choose to strike instead of wrestle with him, because I'm not sure how much success he would have trying to take down Hamza. Because Burns' skill set is not as into the takedown, even though he managed to take down Wonder Boy many times during their fight. But if, usually he's more better on the ground game itself rather than going for a takedown. So that dynamic would be interesting in their fight.
yeah, and I mean, the current champion of the welterweight division, Kamaru Usman, obviously trained with Burns in the past, and he didn't want to go on the floor with Burns. He knew that it would be super dangerous to fight him on the ground, especially with Burns's extensive Brazilian jiu-jitsu background. So it's going to be interesting to see if Khamzat will want to, and it's definitely an interesting match to see how those two styles would play out and how they'd kind of neutralize each other maybe. But I mean, Khamzat's top game is amazing. He's great, and it will definitely be interesting to see how these two stylistically would fare because, I mean, it's just they're both such elite in what they do. Even standing up, both of them are pretty good. So they have each good striking, and it would definitely be such an exciting fight to make, and just to really test Khamzat. If they want to test Khamzat and see if he belongs in the top, putting him against Burns makes sense if they're trying to do that. But yeah, it would definitely be an exciting match, and it would definitely be pretty competitive probably.
And now we're going to talk about why Hamza Chimaev has a high possibility of getting a title shot in 2022.
Yeah, so Khamzat Chimaev obviously wants to be super active this year, even though it's he's not booked yet, which is pretty interesting. Obviously, it's only January, so he still has time to fight a couple times this year, and we don't really know how that's gonna go. But the only real reason he wasn't fighting last year much was because of how he got COVID, and he had it pretty bad. So that was super unfortunate to see. But now that he's clear and he's doing well, we want to see him booked and we want to see him fight. It's kind of like what we expect at this point now because of how easily he's managing these fights. It's like he's not getting hurt in any fight he's in. So
Yeah,
I mean,
he's his own manager at this point.
yeah, and he wants to be active, and And in 2022 to get him a title shot, that's a large task. But I think he really could, especially if he goes up against Burns, which I mean they've verbally agreed on, but it's definitely not confirmed. The UFC obviously hasn't confirmed it, and it might not happen with him versus Gilbert Burns, but if it does, that would fast track him to a title shot if he was able to beat Burns. So I mean, obviously we don't know if he'd be able to beat Burns, but if he was able to, then that would pretty much guarantee him a title shot for this year.
Yeah, and even if Hamza didn't immediately fight Burns, and because the UFC even said themselves that probably Hamza has four more fights until he gets a title shot in their books,
Yeah.
but
Seems like a lot though.
yeah, it definitely seems like a lot, especially because how much hype they have and how they've hyped and how former fighters that have been hyped kind of fast track to the title shot. However, maybe they want to prevent one of those situations where a high potential star kind of loses it by losing to the champion by being rushed too fast. But I feel like in the current standings with him being 11th, and that's why the fight, him fighting Neil Magny and Belal Muhammad is really important for him. As if the UFC is gonna put those kind of the restrictions on him, then if he fights those guys, it plus added to his experience level, and it'll put him even higher into the rankings. So when he eventually does probably fight Burns, it'll look even better for him to gain the title shot.
Yeah, and I mean, right now when you look at the standings of the welterweight division, how the champion right now has been going through everyone. He's went through pretty much all the top guys. I mean, the top three guys he has wins over, which are Colby Covington, Gilbert Burns, and Leon Edwards, and potentially going to fight Leon Edwards again and fought Colby Covington twice. And I mean, he's just been so dominant in the welterweight division. And I mean, if Kamza could work his way up, then it definitely makes sense to get him a title shot in this year, in this calendar year. So I think it could happen with wins, even against Bilal Muhammad, who's a sixth ranked contender. I think even that fight could maybe get him really close to a title shot. I think maybe one more win, or even just get him the title shot there, because I mean the sixth ranked contender. That's a big win if you get a win over that. I think it's possible that Kamza can get a title shot this year, especially if he fights Burns and beats him. And I mean, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if that happened. Obviously, there were talks of Burns versus Khamzat happening on April 9th, which is UFC 273, which that would be super exciting if it happened. But if not, then I guess we're gonna have to do with Khamzat fighting somebody else like a Neil Magny, which is still going to be exciting because it's still going to build him up more. And then in the future, that Burns fight will be even bigger because of the hype if he's able to get past Neil Magny in dominant fashion, which I personally think he would.
If Leon Edwards actually finally gets his title shot against Usman, and let's say Usman beats him, then and also if Hamza gets a fight with Burns and ends up beating him, or even like a Belil, like you said, who's number six ranked, there's really no point kind of not to give him a title shot because who else would they give a title shot to? Because
Yeah.
everyone else would be kind of rematches or trilogies or something along those lines. And I feel like if you really want to spice up the division and make it fresh and keep it kind of new and kind of bringing new contenders for Usman frequently, then it would be a smart idea. And of course, like we've talked about many times, it's important not to rush him because you want this guy to become as highest potential as possible. And the UFC, of course, wants to get as many cash cows as they can for their business. So I'm sure they probably see the importance of not rushing him immediately. That's why they might have not fancied the Burns fight so close. But still, at some point, there's gonna be you can't deny him at some point,
Yeah, I mean, this
pretty
guy has so
much.
much potential. I mean, he's like a mix of Conor McGregor and Khabib. I mean, he's getting so much praise from a lot of his training partners. For example, Alexander Gustafsson, who's a light heavyweight and has had huge wars with a lot of the top light heavyweights. And I mean, he's been giving huge praise to Khamzat and saying that he would beat every welterweight easily, and how he trains with middleweights and light heavyweights and heavyweights, and he's
Super
dominant because
heavyweights.
Super. And I mean, he says he doesn't even train with welterweights because he just it's too
He's too
easy for him.
powerful, and oh
He's
yeah,
he's
he's just
too
too
he's
big, too powerful, and
he's
everything,
too
which is
good,
high
yeah. And
praise.
and he was saying that he would put Usman to sleep, which is a big statement. But obviously, there's bias of being in his team and not being in his side. But just to have Alexander Gustafsson, a guy on that caliber, giving you that kind of praise is super promising for his future. Because I mean, if everything we're hearing about this guy is true, and he has amazing striking, kicking, and obviously his wrestling. He'd really be the full package, and he'd probably be the guy to look out for in the UFC right now.
And just because of Usman being out of contenders and pretty much top competition at least very soon, him versus Hamza would be a really interesting style clash due to both guys being amazing wrestlers and both guys seeming to have huge power in their hands. So in some ways they're a bit similar in some ways, but I feel if Hamza was able to beat Usman, it would like transcend him to a whole nother level, especially considering how dominant Usman has been, just defeating everyone. And if Hamza was able to take the throne, then who knows what level of popularity this guy could get to. We've already seen such a huge increase in his popularity already just from a couple fights.
Yeah, and I think the style of Khamzat would definitely pose a huge threat to Usman. Obviously, both of them having huge power and definitely one-shot knockout power. I mean, the Chechen chain style wrestling that Khamzat possesses would definitely would be interesting to see how it would do against Usman's wrestling, because obviously both of them have extensive wrestling backgrounds. But I think it would be such an interesting fight, and I mean it's hard to say right now, especially because of the unknowns of Khamzat. But I mean, the fact that he's only been hit like 3 times in 4 fights in the UFC, or something crazy like that. I might be a bit off, but that stat is just absurd. The fact that he's been hit so little times, and he has more fights in the UFC than he's been hit, which is just unreal. It just proves how dominant he's been in all of his fights, and he hasn't gone past the second round. So I mean, all these statistics of how this guy's been so dominant, and then you'd watch him fighting, and it's exciting, and it's you want to watch more of him. So I mean, this guy has all the potential, and I think he could definitely get a title shot this year, and if he did, his stardom would raise tremendously. And if he were to get the title, obviously that's another huge thing that he'd have to do. But if he were to dethrone Usman, who's been so dominant over the last couple of years, and has just been going through everyone in the welterweight division, pretty much lapping everyone at this point. And if he was able to beat Usman, that would give him so much credibility in the UFC and just in the world of MMA. So I think it'd be super exciting if that were to happen. If comes out were to fight Usman, and just stylistically it'd be super interesting.
Yeah, and also you have a guy like Li Jing Lian who Hamza just fought, and even though he wasn't ranked the highest, you could say, but still, whenever he usually fights guys, he usually puts them in a war, and is usually very aggressive and is a tough challenge for people because of just he puts them into bad situations.
Not a
But the
challenge for
way
Khamzat.
that yeah, exactly, because the way he put him away was just like picture perfect.
And it's just crazy that not 1 second of that fight did Khamzat have control. He had control the entire fight. For every single second that went by, he was controlling him. He baited him to getting the takedown and carrying him, and just every single thing he did, he just manipulated the hell out of him, and it was just absurd.
And the most like intriguing thing about him as a whole is just pretty much the unknowns as in a total as because we already know how his extensive wrestling career. If we see that he's a talented striker and kickboxer, then that would just be huge for everything because it would just show the evolution of him and could be even a new breed of fighters where it's just completely evolved and he's just talented in every aspect of MMA. And if we continue to see this type of dominance, like he could be reigning over the UFC for a very long time to come. And it's not like he's an older fighter. He's not the
He's
youngest, you
super
could say,
young.
but yeah, but he's still in his 20s. And if this guy could take over, especially somewhat soon, he's gonna be reigning over the UFC for a long time. And also, he's only been training in combat sports for not that long. Obviously, his wrestling, he's been doing it for all of his life, but in MMA, he hasn't been training there for too long. And if he were to climb the ranks, he would have a lot of durability as he hasn't been hit that many times in his career thus far.
Yeah, and I mean he's huge as well for the welterweight division. I mean all these guys he towers over, and I mean there's a reason that Gustafsson was saying that. I mean he'd be going through all these welterweights because he's huge, and the way he's been dominating and just overpowering everyone has been absurd. So I mean, I think it'd definitely be interesting to see how he does, even at middleweight, because I mean he's fought there before, and it looks like he can make that pretty comfortably. So it's definitely interesting to see where this guy goes. His potential is really unmatched in the UFC, and it's going to be exciting.
And now we're going to be talking about a super anticipated fight in Dustin Poirier versus Nate Diaz. These guys were supposed to fight quite a couple of years back, and it's been kind of in the making, on and off and on and off. And I feel like now, especially, would be a perfect time to make it, as Dustin Poirier is coming off the loss to the lightweight champion Charles Oliveira, and said he's hasn't found anything too interesting other than that Nate Diaz fight at welterweight, and also Nate Diaz coming off a loss, and he's been posting a lot about the Dustin Poirier fight and talking about how the UFC didn't find him valuable, Dustin Poirier valuable for the fight, but I feel like this would be the
Sorry,
absolute
the
perfect
UFC said he
time.
sucks. Sorry, Dustin.
Yeah, I guess according to Nate Diaz, Dustin just sucks from the UFC, but and they've just been having a huge back and forth on all social medias, talking a lot of crap to each other, and I feel this is pretty much the perfect time to make this fight, and there's really been no better time, and just from all the on and off of this fight, it's just made this bout even bigger and bigger and bigger, and now this is a huge fan favorite fight for everyone to see.
Yeah, I mean, like they were scheduled to fight all the way back on like UFC 230, so a couple of years ago, and now with the star power and the rise of Dustin Poirier obviously beating Conor McGregor twice this year or last year now. So I mean, his star has gone up tremendously, but having that loss to Charles Oliveira was kind of was kind of hard for him. So I mean, I think he wants to go up to welterweight at least for this one off against Nate Diaz, because of course fighting Nate Diaz you're gonna go up to welterweight, but I mean, he definitely they're both interested. Dustin Poirier is definitely interested. I mean, like 3 days after the Charles Oliveira fight, he was already like booked that fight for January, even though that didn't end up
Yeah,
happening.
that's
They
yeah.
both just wanted it already, like right off the bat. But I think realistically for this fight to happen, I mean, Jorge Masvidal, Colby Covington just got booked for UFC 272 for the main event. The undercard of that fight is gonna be all non-title fights, obviously. So I think this fight would be perfect on that card. So I think that's definitely possible. And there's been talks of this fight happening. Dustin Poirier claimed that they were in pretty good talks, and that this fight would happen relatively soon. So I think it might happen, and it'd be so interesting and so exciting, because this is such an anticipated fight.
Yeah, and it would be a lot bigger than when it was first booked at UFC 230, as now Dustin Poirier has just rose and rose and rose in fame after beating Max Holloway, after beating Dan Hooker, after beating Conor McGregor twice, and also even though he lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov and also to Charles Oliveira, this still kind of pushed his name even further, as now more people know him, and of course Nate Diaz people know he's one of the biggest stars in the sport,
Yeah.
after especially after being Conor in that upset in their first fight, and just now, especially with all these different terms compared to their first fight, it would just make the fight so much more interesting and so much better. And I'm sure both of these guys have as well gotten better as well. Definitely displayed from the Poirier side, even though he lost his last fight. It was evident in the Conor McGregor fights, and you could see the improvement from him. And you could see by the skills of the two, and how Nate Diaz is iron chin.
Yeah.
The guy is just like a zombie, just keeps coming and coming and coming. And Dustin Poirier versus him would be a great fight due to we know Poirier has a lot of power, able to drop Charles a couple times, and it would be interesting to see how the striking would match up, and also if maybe Nate Diaz would try to utilize his ground game with jiu-jitsu, of course being able to tap out Conor McGregor in their first fight. So it would be interesting to see what kind of tools and weapons they would use. I think personally it would definitely be a stand-up fight, as that's what kind of Nate Diaz wants to bring
That's what
as
they
well to the
promised.
table, and both guys, yeah, and it would be probably a war. And I think I definitely think that Poirier would win that fight, as Nate Diaz hasn't been that active other than that Leon Edwards fight, and he's been kind of losing quite a few fights recently, even though it's been to very tough guys, but still, and Dustin has just looked apart from losing to Charles Oliveira, who of course is a fantastic fighter. So So no huge shame in that, but otherwise he looked amazing in there.
Yeah, even though this probably will be a stand-up fight, both of these guys have black belts in jiu-jitsu. So they both are able to do that as well, and they have great grappling. So it would be it's just an overall interesting fight, and it's definitely anticipated because this fight has been in the makings for so long, and the trash talk these guys have for each other. And they've just been going back and forth for the last couple of weeks. It's just been rolling and rolling and riling up, and it's just been going even more. So I mean, it makes sense for both of them. Nate Diaz obviously wanting to get a credible win in the sport after coming off his loss to Leon Edwards, and he's not currently ranked in welterweight. And obviously Dustin Poirier coming off his loss to Charles Oliveira. So I think it makes sense, and I think it will happen because I mean the UFC just makes the fights we want to see. So I think why not make this one as well? So the boxing would
Unlike
be
boxing.
yeah, unlike boxing. I mean, their boxing abilities are tremendous, and it would definitely be interesting to see how they would do in the feet. But yeah, I think Poirier would definitely have the advantage, especially just with his style. He has super tricky style with like effective shoulder rolls, and his head movement is pretty good. And obviously his switch combos and the way he deceives his opponents. So I think he'd do well in the feet there. And I think it'd just be an overall good fight.
Yeah, and this fight would definitely take place in welterweight, as Dustin Poirier for a long time now been talking about moving up from lightweight to welterweight. Of course, we know how he's a massive lightweight,
Yeah.
and I don't, and of course made featherweight somehow, but he's just massive for that frame in general. And Nate Diaz has been fighting at welterweight. Of course, he's fought at lightweight before, but for all of his recent fights, he's been fighting at welterweight, and he's looked better there from when he's fought at lightweight. And I think that's more of his. It's where he kind of performs better. So this fight would definitely end up there, and I wonder how that would affect things with mainly Dustin Poirier, as what aspects of his game would change, and maybe he would try to implement some different things because he would be bigger
And just
than
more
his
comfortable.
other fights.
Just more
Yeah,
comfortable
definitely more
making weight.
comfortable.
Yeah. And I mean they're both UFC like veterans. They've been in with the UFC for over 10 years. And they've been with the organization for a long time, and they have a lot of experience, and a lot of the fans love to see both of them, and both of them having two fights with Conor McGregor, who's obviously the biggest star in the sport by far, has given both of these guys a huge push in the sport and just becoming huge draws individually. So yeah, them two going off against each other would definitely be super exciting. And I mean, their careers have definitely evolved the last couple of years. With I mean, Dustin rising to fame by beating Conor and beating Justin Gaethje and Eddie Alvarez, all these different guys that he's been going through, and obviously his him coming up short against Khabib and Oliveira, but those two are such great submission artists, and they were able to both get him out of there in the third round. So it would definitely be interesting to see how this would do. And as you said, in welterweight, with Dustin being able to make that weight much more comfortably, it would be interesting to see how that would impact things. Um, and yeah, it would just be a super exciting fight.
And yeah, this would be a fans match made in heaven, because both of these guys love to go to war. Both of these guys love to scrap and just go at it 110%. And it would be interesting to see if someone breaks first, what's happened, like what will happen if Nate Diaz might get dropped, what might happen if Poirier gets stunned and he gets out cardioed by, of course, the cardio freak of Nate Diaz, and just the sheer volume from Nate Diaz, as of course we know he's more of a volume fighter, and when he really pours it on and pours on that pressure, is where guys tend to crack, sort of like obviously not the same style as Max Holloway, but kind of like those volume type fighters, where they just push the pressure on you, especially when you're tired. That's Nate Diaz's main thing. When you're tired, like how he beat Conor in the first fight, he just started pouring it on, pouring it on, pouring it on. And it's not like all of his strikes have the most intentions with them, because you see a lot of that, like the Stockton slap, he just throws them out there, but they all continuously add up. Where otherwise Justin Poirier is more of a hard hitting fighter, and he more throws shots to hurt with his
Yeah.
shift combinations and his different straight punches and hooks. They're more powerful, so that clash will be interesting to see between the two.
Yeah, and I mean the bad blood would definitely be interesting, but I think the edge in this fight, of course, goes to Dustin Poirier. I mean, he's just had a lot of success in recent years. While Nate Diaz hasn't been active, and when he has, he came up short against both Masvidal and Leon Edwards. So I think definitely stylistically, and I mean just resume wise right now, it definitely favors Dustin Poirier. I think he'd probably win that. maybe knock down Nate Diaz a couple of times. But I mean, Nate Diaz is as tough as they come, so it would be interesting if he'd be able to get him out of there, because not many people are able to. So yeah, definitely be an exciting fight, and this is definitely the fight to make in the UFC.
So now we're going to be talking about the matchup coming up at UFC 272 between Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington. It's finally happening. It's finally happening. This fight is so anticipated. It has been so anticipated with everything, of course, the huge bad blood and all the crap that these guys have talked towards each other, and it's finally coming. And what's super interesting, how this is gonna be the first pay-per-view headline in the UFC in like 5 years, other than also Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz, without a title fight on the line, without being involved and caused kind of by Conor McGregor. So that just goes to show how big and popular this fight is in the fans, in the media, and everything,
Yeah, and
and just how huge it
how big
is.
of a star both these guys have become in the last couple of years. I mean, Jorge Masvidal's rise to popularity was insane with his 6 second knockout of Ben Askren, obviously with his second round knockout of Darren Till, and then his third round stoppage against Nate Diaz. I mean, all three of those fights just rose him to popularity one by one by one, and he's just been super exciting. Obviously, coming off those two losses to the champion. Kamaru Usman, and obviously that knockout, which is definitely going to be interesting to see how that affects things, because I mean, in his professional career of over 50 fights, he hasn't been knocked out once, besides to Kamaru Usman. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see if maybe that affects his confidence, maybe if that affects his game, but he's a veteran, and I don't know if it will, because he's been able to recover from some tough losses, and he has 15 losses on his MMA record. So I think he'll be able to deal with it, but it's definitely going to be interesting to see if maybe that could play a factor in this.
And also, how you mentioned Jorge Masvidal coming a huge star. Colby Covington as well has built his brand up ever since his Damian Maia fight, and just turned heel, and with his huge promos and pretty much just being a huge polarizing figure. Whether you love him or hate him, he's a huge character in the sport now.
Yeah.
And coming off as well, or coming off that Usman lost both guys, and it's gonna be interesting to see how each guy kind of evolves from that loss and what they're able to kind of adapt. And this is a very fight. It's a very different fight other than Kamaru Usman, as one guy in Jorge Masvidal is an elite striker and great kickboxer, and then with also great takedown defense. But and then there's Colby Covington, who's an elite wrestler and who's also a good stand up.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be interesting how these styles clash, and in this fight that everyone wants to see, and it should be a great one.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the most interesting thing about this fight is that they've trained before together and that they were best friends. And I mean, just the fact that they've trained together and like for years, and obviously had many fights in the gym and sparring sessions, and they probably know exactly how each other fight and each other's strengths, each other weaknesses, how effective they are in certain areas against each other, and just that unique dynamic of this fight is definitely gonna be super interesting. So I think that's definitely gonna play a role, and it's gonna be interesting to see how that plays. I think on the feet, Masvidal definitely has an edge in terms of his striking ability. I mean, Colby's not bad at striking himself, but I think Masvidal definitely has an edge in that aspect. But I mean, it's just going to be such an interesting fight, and it's going to be interesting to see how they determine their game plans and how they execute an effective game plan against each other. Because I mean, they both know each other's abilities and their skills and their what their strengths and weaknesses are. So I think it would definitely be super interesting to see how that plays into effect, um, along with their stylistic matchup.
Yeah, and also one thing that I kind of wish we got out of this, just because of how anticipated it was Ultimate Fighter season, as that would
Yeah.
have just upped the entertainment so much, even higher somehow than it already is, and we would have just had so much build up to this fight. But speaking of the build up itself, the build up to this fight, like alone, is just gonna be insane. And could you just imagine the war of words we're
Yeah.
gonna be hearing in these press conferences and everything, and who knows what's gonna go down in here pretty much. And it's really interesting to see how these guys came from amazing friends trying to build up into the game, into the MMA game, and just trying to level themselves up both skill wise and name wise. And then now they've diverted into enemies, and they're gonna fight after coming off of being or after being huge friends and in the
Yeah.
same gym, in the same team, and now they're gonna be clashing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see how this fight will turn out. I think if it goes by, I think if someone gets a knockout, I think it's gonna be by Masvidal, who's gonna be able to keep it standing. If he's able to defend takedowns well, which we've seen him be able to do pretty well, but it's going to be interesting to see if Masvidal could knock out Colby. I think when it comes to a decision, Colby would definitely be able to outpace Masvidal with. I mean, he has amazing cardio and just an amazing volume fighter. So I think if it goes to points, it goes to Colby. I think if it's by submission, it's definitely Colby. So yeah, I think if either of them are going to get a knockout, I think definitely Masvidal has that edge. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this fight turns out. I mean, Masvidal's striking game is amazing. I mean, who knows? We could just see a 6 second KO, just like just like the Ben Askren fight. You never know. But I mean, Colby is such an elite fighter. I don't see him really letting anything like that happen for sure. But I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see how they're gonna neutralize each other's abilities. And I mean, they know how each other fight, but it's gonna be interesting to see their improvements since the last time they've trained with each other. I mean, Masvidal continuing to train an American top team, and Colby going to MMA Masters, and it's gonna be interesting to see who's developed more as a fighter and who's developed more to develop the better game plan.
Yeah, and how we were talking about Jorge Masvidal maybe potentially being able to knock out Colby Covington, and because of Jorge Masvidal getting knocked out cold by Kamaru Usman, what if his chin's also what if his chin's affected, and maybe we could see even though Colby's more of a volume guy, what if we see him actually being able to stop Masvidal on the feet? Wouldn't
That
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 be
would
something
be that would be
crazy?
crazy. I mean,
No one would expect that. No
it's
one.
also going to be interesting to see how they have each developed coming off of their fights with Kamaru Usman. I mean, when you compare their performances, obviously Colby has by far the edge, and performance-wise, I mean, his first fight with Kamaru Usman was very close. I think it was probably even going into that last round. And I mean, Kamaru obviously got the stoppage there, the fake stoppage with the fake ref.
As Colby likes to say.
With Jorge's first fight against Kamaru Usman, he pretty much just got dominated throughout every round, and pretty much got I think 50-45 or 50-44. It was pretty
It was
dominant. It
bad.
was pretty dominant on Usman's part. So I mean,
To
he
be
was
fair, he had a short camp, but well, I guess we saw what happened when he had a full
yeah,
camp. He kind
he
of
did
got
have he,
done
he
even
was on six
worse.
days notice, so he didn't really have fully time to prepare a game plan or prepare a strategy to beat Usman. But with that first fight, definitely wasn't in his wasn't as good as Colby's performance, nowhere near. And then obviously that second fight as well, um, Jorge's performance definitely didn't match Colby's. Obviously getting knocked out in the second round brutally, and Colby being able to make it a really competitive fight this time around. I mean, both of the time arounds they're pretty competitive, but uh, made it really competitive, and Usman got the nod probably by 1 round, and yeah, it was definitely a competitive fight, and Colby made it really competitive, and it was a great fight as well. So I think when you compare their performances, obviously Colby has an edge, but at the same time, styles make fights, and the styles of Jorge and Colby are completely different. So we're gonna see how this turns out.
Yeah, and I feel like the biggest factor in this fight will most likely be Colby's most likely Colby's wrestling skill, as what he's people mostly think he's the second best or best with Kamaru Usman wrestlers in the division, and depending on how good really Jorge Masvidal's takedown defense is, we know it's good, but is it good enough for Colby's takedowns, and will he be able to hold Jorge down and kind of just dominate him is a big question as well
Yeah.
that people think is going to happen. And depending on how this could either be a really dominant fight, or maybe if Jorge is able to get up or maybe just defend it completely, it could really go to Jorge's advantage by keeping it on the feet.
Yeah, and I think when the odds released, I think it was a sizable favor in favor of Colby Covington, which is definitely
Yeah.
interesting, and I think it obviously makes sense considering their last couple of fights, their last two fights, where Masvidal got stopped by Usman and lost to him, and then Colby Covington having a win against Tyron Woodley and a close fight against Kamaru Usman. So I mean, you're only as good as your last fight, right? So the odds definitely make sense there. Um, I'm pretty sure Jorge was like plus 300, which is a pretty sizable favorite in favor of Colby. So I think it's definitely going to be interesting to see if Masvidal could pull off the upset and maybe hurt Colby. I mean, we've seen him do it before. I mean, I think he was pretty sure he was an underdog against Ben Askren. So you never know.
Now we're going to be talking about whether Jake Paul is going to be entering the MMA world and who knows, even potentially signing with the UFC. We've seen a video recently posted by Jake Paul of him showing his kicks, and he tagged it as first kicks, and then
Yeah.
he said added Bellator and PFLs. Kind of putting it in. Maybe he's looking to enter the MMA world, and of course he's already mentioned before. He said, I'm pretty sure after he goes, as he said, 10-0 in boxing.
Yeah.
He said that he'll enter the MMA world and compete. And how interesting would that be? First off, he's first got to get 10-0.
Yeah.
And
win a world
if he does,
championship.
imagine yeah, of course, and beat Canelo and everyone else,
Yeah.
of course,
Pretty much just
and become the GOAT,
yeah.
and then retire.
And then
But
fight in MMA.
if he is able to transition to MMA, of course we know he has a wrestling background, as he's wrestled in high school at a pretty high level in Ohio, and to see how he translate into MMA, it would be interesting to see, as of course we know now he has developed boxing skills and for MMA it's a whole different striking game though. It's not like how in boxing it's only your fists. You
Yeah.
got elbows, you got all types of different stuff. So he would have to learn that and kind of adjust to MMA, but I feel like if you really were to, like, let's say if you really were to go serious deep dive into it and pretty much train this whole thing, I feel train full on. I feel like his wrestling background, it would really be a backbone for him, and it could get him some decent success if he really puts as much effort as he is into boxing right now.
Yeah, and I mean, as you were saying, that striking in boxing isn't necessarily the striking in MMA, and even the on the feet striking is completely different. I mean, when you learn footwork in boxing and when you learn footwork in MMA, it's completely different. And even the way you block and how the gloves are 4 ounces in MMA, you can't just put your hands up and expect shots to be blocked. Doesn't work like that. It's completely different striking, and he'd have to learn a completely different sport, which would be very hard for him. And I don't know if he'd be able to pull it off, and it doesn't really make sense in my opinion because it's just come on, like why would he go into MMA? I mean, he's making millions off of boxing and just calling out whoever he wants and then just picking and choosing his fights that he wants. So I mean, he's obviously called out Jorge Masvidal for a UFC fight. He said
Yeah,
he called out Dana White, said he'd fight a one fight deal in MMA if Dana accepted his
no
offer.
chance, no
No chance
chance.
he'd ever
Realistically,
go to
no.
MMA to fight bro. He would. I don't think he'd even enter the
No
octagon in
chance.
general. So I mean, going to MMA and fighting Masvidal, who is one of the top six welterweights in the world right now, and is obviously such a talented MMA fighter, brilliant kickboxer, and it just obviously would not fight Jake Paul in MMA. Maybe in boxing that could be a competitive fight, but in MMA just stop. Like we're done.
Yeah, nah.
And
It just makes no sense. Maybe I could see Jake Paul entering the octagon as like a one-time thing, maybe
yeah,
once he's fully done with boxing.
like a
But otherwise, it
one-off.
makes no sense. Yeah, like a one-off. Like you said, he's making so much money in boxing, and there's no point to risk it having to learn an entire new sport, which would be very difficult for him. And he would have to try to adapt and learn all these different techniques and all these different ways of training. And first off, if he were like I just like in boxing, how it would be tough to become elite. I wouldn't at all see him becoming elite in MMA, but at least maybe he could become a decent level at it if he really trained, like the amount of years at least he's putting into boxing. Of course, we don't fully know what level he's at yet in boxing, as he's only fought
UFC fighter.
he's only fought a couple of guys and UFC guys, so it's a bit different than fighting a full-on boxer. But we are yet to see, and just for him to transition to MMA it would be a rough challenge for him, and it just doesn't really make sense at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if he did go into MMA, he'd probably fight a boxer. Because I mean, everyone
Yeah.
everyone claiming, yo, Jake Paul needs to fight a boxer. You'll pull up Canelo in
You'll
MMA.
finally fight a boxer, yeah.
That's the only way he'd fight a boxer. But I mean, it's just it would definitely be interesting if he were to enter the octagon. I mean, there's so much you'd have to learn. First of all, just obviously a completely just different sport, and there's so much to learn in MMA. It's such a complicated sport with all the martial arts that are in there, and most people are in MMA are one-dimensional. So, I mean, it's not the biggest stretch to say he can at least like become at least like a certain level. I mean, he is athletic, and you've seen him at least advance in boxing to a certain point, right? So, I mean, if he was fully dedicated to MMA and actually wanted to be a real MMA fighter and trained for years, and obviously he's rich, so he has access to the high level training. I mean, he said he'd train with Team Khabib, which that would be insane if he actually did. Imagine Jake Paul training with Khabib.
You
Just
just see a photo of Khabib just wrestling with Jake.
Jake Paul joins Eagle FC.
UFC, yeah. He'll
Uh,
fight Kevin Lee in his debut.
yeah, that
Both
165.
guys debut. Yeah,
165.
no, tell Kevin Lee to come up to 190 and face him.
Yeah, definitely.
Had a catch weight.
The catch rate. But I
Fair
mean,
play. It's a fair
I mean,
play.
back to all seriousness. I think it doesn't really make sense. I mean, he's making so much money in boxing. He's literally making millions by just fighting guys who aren't even boxers right now. But he is looking to fight a boxer potentially, and I mean, there's no reason. There's literally zero reason for him to have just learned all of this in boxing, put his life on the line to go into the boxing ring and learn all of what he's learned in boxing, just to like throw that all away and just be like, fuck it, I'm doing MMA now. Like
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
not doing that. If anyone thinks he's doing that, you're dreaming, because there's not
Yeah,
a chance that he's gonna be able to do that, or that he wants to do that, because he's done
yeah,
all this in boxing. He's not just gonna throw it all away. Makes no sense. But for him to sign with the UFC for a one fight deal with Masvidal,
yeah. And there's just, well, first of all, there's zero, like, literally like zero chance he signs with the UFC.
yeah.
And maybe like a one-time thing with Bellator or PFL, but no way
Actually,
UFC. As he's literally,
it's possible.
literally made so many
I think
statements
it's possible.
saying how the pay is wrong in the UFC, and it would be kind of contradicting, and just it would look bad on him if after all this thing he's talked about the UFC and were to just join it. It would look weird for him and his kind of character, and make him people even question more his shtick, I
Okay,
guess you
but
could say.
realistically, he joins MMA. He's not gonna join Bellator or PFL. I think I
True, but
I, I I think
it's tough to
I
say.
think I mean obviously Dana's had big rivalries with a lot of different people that he ended up coming to terms with. I mean, Tyron Woodley was his champion for like a couple of years, and they never got on good terms. Obviously Ben Askren as well. They didn't sign him until he was in his late 30s, and he was already retired at that point. So I mean, I think obviously those are completely different situations. This isn't Jake. These aren't guys who are calling out Dana White every minute and trolling him and calling out his fighter pay and his
Yeah,
system
it's
and
not the
all this.
same, but
It's
like,
it's completely different. But I if Jake Paul actually entered MMA, he's not gonna fight in Bellator or PFL. I think he's somehow gonna come up to an agreement. And I mean, he'd probably make the UFC money if he were to join. And I don't know if it is contradicting for him to join the UFC, because I mean, the whole reason he's been calling out the UFC is because they don't pay their fighters. So I mean, if he joins the UFC and then he doesn't get paid, I mean, he kind of just played himself, not really. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
one reason why it could be possible for maybe Bellator to have one fight there is due to Scott Coker, who's the owner and of Bellator, has some connections with Showtime boxing, which Jake has been fighting at. So maybe something might go down there. And you know what actually would be a decent, or would make sense kind of as a fight for maybe MMA. Obviously Jake Paul would get killed, but like
What is it?
just imaginary, like Dylan Dennis, as because we
Oh,
know all of their beef they've had there. Obviously, Jake would get his leg snapped off,
Jake would absolutely
but
get mauled. That would not be
yeah,
fun.
you'd get his leg snapped off. But still, like I guess hypothetically,
Yeah, one fight in
the beef
boxing, one
wise, it
fight
makes
in MMA.
sense. But yeah, but yeah, realistically, I don't see Jake Paul entering MMA as a whole, and probably just sticking to boxing. And now we're going to be talking about a potential matchup that's been in some speculation between Jake Paul and Julio Cesar Chavez Jr.
So obviously Jake Paul has been calling out Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. for a boxing match, which I mean, this is This is a tough one to say. I mean, Julio Cesar Chavez, obviously the son of one of the best Mexican fighters of all time, Julio Cesar Chavez, and I mean, he's honestly he does not have a good reputation himself, just as a fighter, and I mean, he's just known to be
Understatement.
he's known to be someone who's just not dedicated to the sport of boxing, with a pretty bad reputation as a partier and a smoker and drinker, and just isn't dedicated to the sport. He doesn't dedicate his life to it. Meanwhile, Jake Paul is a young guy who's hungry, to be fair to him, but nowhere near the experience of Julio Cesar Chavez Jr.
Yeah.
with Jr. having over 60 fights in boxing, literally over 60 fights, with 53 of them being wins, and Jake Paul being 5-0 with 5 wins. So, I mean,
Yeah, and Junior has even talked about if Jake Paul accepted this fight and if he were to lose, then he would retire from boxing,
yeah.
which I'm sure a lot of fans would be happy about hearing. but,
Yeah, that would.
but still, like imagine Jake Paul being the one to put out one of the greatest Mexican champions of all time, son, into
Yeah, and, and
retirement.
and and he's a former world champion. I mean, he held the
Yeah,
WBC middleweight title for a year or two. So, I mean,
yeah, as much as people like to kind of like clown on him and stuff, he was still a champion in boxing at the end of
yeah,
the day. Regardless of how many championships are in boxing,
yeah. How many
it's still
belts?
something.
Yeah, it's still
Yeah,
a champion. Like, a champion's a champion at the end of the day. There are a lot of talented fighters that never even earned a championship. I mean, Jake Paul's head coach, BJ Flores, was an amazing fighter in his own right, but he never even held a championship. So, I mean, to fight someone who was a former champion in Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., it would definitely be interesting. But I mean, he is not the greatest representative of the boxing world. I mean, he's 2-3 in his last fights, and I mean, his second last fight was coming off a loss to, I mean, MMA legend Anderson Silva, who was never a boxer, and he's 46 years old. And I mean, Julio Cesar Chavez, in all honesty, he should have won that fight. Even I'm not trying to discredit Anderson at all, but I mean, just for Anderson Silva to do what he did at 46 years old was incredibly impressive. But what a letdown from Julio Cesar Chavez, getting beat by an MMA fighter. Obviously, Anderson was one of the best strikers in UFC history, in MMA history. So, I mean, I'm not trying to take that away from him, but I think it definitely is a pretty bad look for Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. to be losing him.
yeah. I feel like if this fight played out between Jake Paul and Junior, I feel like Junior would heavily underestimate Jake Paul,
Yeah,
especially with his past known occurrences of not training hard and just kind of taking it easy, doing partying, doing all this wild stuff. Imagine he just comes in just completely unprepared,
just
underestimating
thinks he's a
this
YouTuber.
YouTuber Disney
Yeah,
kid,
Disney
just
kid.
like yeah, Disney kid, and then just gets knocked out.
Yeah, and I
Could
mean,
you imagine
just his
though?
history of just not performing under the pressure. I mean, Jake Paul might be able to even get inside of his head, which would be crazy because I mean, Jake Paul likes to put a lot of pressure and ramp up all the pressure he can on his opponents. I mean, with him making Tyron Woodley get a tattoo, with him making Tommy Fury get changing his name, he wants to put on as much pressure as possible against his opponents, and I think if he was able to, or if you tried to get inside of Chavez's head, it would definitely be interesting. I feel like that could maybe impact the fight and how it would happen, or how would it play out. But yeah, I mean, this would be super interesting to see, if this fight got booked, because I mean, the experience gap and the difference between their experience. I mean, Chavez was an elite boxer, and Jake Paul is some kid who decided to box one day and is now 3 years in. Obviously, dedicated his life to it, so credit to him and got an amazing team. But definitely should not be beating a guy on Julio Cesar Chavez's caliber quite yet.
Yeah, and on paper, Chavez Jr. has all the tools in the world imaginable to beat Jake Paul and has all the experience, over 50 pro fights, and even to think that he could lose this to Jake Paul is just kind of sad. Just because we know how undedicated he is to sport. And it would honestly just be like the boxing world would go ballistic. They would go, it would like the whole boxing world as a total would just go crazy. But if Jake were to actually somehow, even if he put up a good fight, like a good fight, it would still be kind of telling on Jake and how he's kind of improved as a boxer as he's come on this journey. And I definitely feel as a next opponent, it's too fast for Jake,
Yeah,
as that is
you
such
don't
a
want
bump in,
that. No, I don't
regardless
think
of
so.
anything. It's a huge bump in
Yeah,
competition
for
and
a
just too
couple
much
of
for
years
Jake.
in, I think that's not fair to put him in there against this kind of caliber. I know everyone's saying fight a boxer, and that's why he really wants to do it. And I think a real reason that Jake Paul might actually want to do this fight is because Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fought Canelo and went 12 rounds with Canelo. So I think if this fight ever happened and Jake Paul landed a punch from the gods, a one punch KO, then he'd be able to say he stopped someone that Canelo couldn't. That's something
Yeah.
a lot of people don't think about. I mean, Jake Paul likes to he's the master of this shit. He he'll do anything he can to troll someone. And I mean that would be super interesting. I mean him like if he were to stop Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., which I definitely don't think would happen. Think if I just it just doesn't make sense in my head for him to beat
Yeah.
him. Like it doesn't compute. I don't think that would happen. But something I found interesting is, I mean, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. did say, I mean, Jake Paul's a big guy with a lot of power, and that he would need to gain weight for this fight. Which I mean, that's just simply not true. I mean, this guy has an extensive history of missing weight and coming out of shape. Like like I mean, his fight with Anderson Silva was at a catch weight of 175 pounds, and he weighed in at 185 pounds, literally 10 pounds over the
Yeah.
the catch weight limit. And I mean, obviously Jake Paul fights at 190 pounds, so going 5 pounds over where
Yeah.
you missed
It's not a big deal
is
for him.
is not a sizable is not a big size advantage. But I mean, to be fair to him, he did fight in 5 divisions in boxing, all the way from like 140 pounds all the way to now 185 pounds when he's missing weight. But I just don't think it's that big of a deal to say you need to put on size against this guy. And that's like going to be an issue for a fight between you guys. Like, no, that's not an issue, man. You can it's just you've been coming at 185 for the
Yeah.
past. I mean, his last fight was at like I think he weighed in like 187 pounds. Like that's literally 3 pounds off. So that's definitely not an excuse for him to make. Um, or to say. But I mean, yeah, this would be crazy. I don't think Jake would want this fight. I think his next fight that is in the works is still gonna be Tommy Fury. I know a lot of people think that fight might not happen, and how Jake Paul has been saying that he doesn't want to give Tommy Fury the time of day or the payday or whatever this and that. But I just think it makes all the sense compared to anyone else. I mean, he's not gonna get a guy in the UFC. I'm pretty sure Nate Diaz's contract has been extended,
Yeah.
which I mean,
So I don't see that happening.
there's been like different reports of it has been extended, and then there's people still talking about it like it's not extended, so it's not really clear to me. I'm not really sure, but I don't think the UFC would let Nate Diaz go out and fight Jake Paul. Definitely not. Dana White
Definitely
has
not.
no interest in
And
letting that happen. But if he were to, if Diaz did get out of his contract, I mean, if he fights Poirier in what, let's say Nate Diaz gets matched up against Poirier in the undercard of Masvidal versus Colby, then that would happen in March, and then he'd get released in March, and he'd be able to fight Jake when he comes back from his break. So if his contract is not extended from the UFC, I think Nate Diaz definitely makes sense for his next fight. But I think overall, I think his next fight will be Tommy Fury,
yeah.
and just makes the most sense. 7-0, they have a similar experience.
Even though Tommy Fury makes the most sense out of all the fights to be next, especially since Nate Diaz is probably as we think is extended on his contract, so that won't work. And even though Tommy Fury makes the most sense, but all the contributors to this, with Jake Paul saying he won't give Tommy Fury the time of day, it kind of like in a way you can see how the Chavez Jr. fight could make sense in a way, as especially it's not like Junior is going to fight for a title, so he would be open to fighting Jake whenever. And let's say Jake's actually crazy enough to go for this fight, it could definitely happen. It can definitely become possible, as it's not like Jake right now as of right now has like a ton of options. Main option probably Tommy Fury, as of course Tommy Fury wants that payday any day of the week,
Yeah.
but otherwise he doesn't have so many options.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Jake Paul, I don't think he would want this fight automatically against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Like imagine he fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and then he went down to Tommy Fury. Like no, you're not you're
Yeah,
not
it wouldn't make
you're not going
sense.
down to Tommy Fury at that point. You have to fight Tommy Fury now and then fight Chavez Jr. But I mean, it's just like this guy's such a veteran, and even though he has this history of being a non-dedicated fighter. I think he'd definitely beat Jake Paul, probably stop him, but maybe not. I mean, he didn't usually fight at this high of a weight class back in the day. So I mean, he could maybe not have the power to be able to stop him. I mean, he wasn't really able to have any power to hurt Anderson Silva in that fight. So maybe he wouldn't be able to hurt Jake, and maybe that would be a win for Jake if he was just able to go the distance, kind of like Logan Paul versus Floyd Mayweather, even though that's a completely different situation.
Yeah, I feel like yeah, there's many ways. Other if he even just lost, there's ways that he could win just by like you said going the distance because this is such a challenge. And even though we all know Jake Paul would never get the props,
Yeah,
even if even
even if
if
he
he
won.
beat
Yeah,
Chavez Jr.,
yeah.
even if he knocked him out, everyone just say Chavez Jr. is just some bomb and whatever, and he doesn't train. But people at some point at least gotta give some sort of credit because let's say he's crazy enough to actually go
Bro,
fight
even
Chavez
just
Jr.
taking this
and put
fight,
up a
he should
good
get so
fight.
much credit if he took it.
Yeah, and put up a good fight, it would be absurd, and especially with how little of a kind of career Jake Paul has had, and how much of a vet and experienced fighter. And we all know that Chavez Jr. like has so much boxing knowledge from his family as well, and all these different things. And if Jake Paul was to go out there and put up a decent scrap and good competition, it would definitely look huge for Jake Paul. And even though it might in the overall media affect him negatively a bit with people saying oh he lost and whatever,
Yeah.
it would still show a huge thing for him and how he's kind of evolved and improved as a fighter.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, when it comes to like heart and determination, who will want this more? I mean, it's a landslide of Jake Paul. I mean, Julio
Yeah,
Cesar Chavez is not somebody who wants it. He's not somebody who will turn up in the big occasion and try to get the win. I mean, Jake Paul has been seen to he can take he's taken shots from Tyron Woodley, who's one of the biggest punchers in 170 pounds in the UFC in the welterweight. So, I mean, he's taken shots from him and obviously knocked him out brutally. Obviously, he has that one punch knockout power, and that knockout's just gonna give him more confidence. He's gonna be more confident in that right hand, and I mean, it's just gonna be. If he was even able to get this fight and like go the distance, like let's say he went the distance with Chavez Jr., even if he lost, like he could still say he went the distance with someone Canelo went the distance with, like that's a huge win for him as well, like just that alone.
yeah,
But I think it just doesn't make sense for him to go straight into this fight. It's such a large task to ask for in your sixth fight of your boxing career when you haven't boxed even you it's not like you were an amateur. It's like you just came into boxing randomly and just got a team and just became a boxer. So I just don't think he'd be able to beat Chavez, but if he could, that would be unreal. And I mean, another fight that would be possible if he were to beat Chavez Jr. I think a logical step would be Anderson Silva, who also beat Chavez Jr. Right?
yeah.
Because I mean,
Hmm.
Anderson Silva is one of the best MMA fighters of all time. He's probably the GOAT, probably one of them. That would be insane, but obviously Anderson Silva is so old, so even if he won that as well, he'd not get the
Yeah.
credit. I mean, there's the only way he'd get credit in the boxing world is if he were to beat Canelo and Mike Tyson on the same night.
Yeah. But of course, Tommy Fury is still there for Jake, and according to his options, I still think that's technically his the best fight for him to choose next. But I guess you never know, and let's see if that doesn't plan to happen. The Tommy Fury fight, maybe he actually is crazy enough, and if Chavez Jr. actually also accepts, maybe we could see a fight between them. But right now, I just definitely don't see it happening next.
So that's going to be it for this podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed, and let us know some more suggestions you guys want us to talk about on the podcast. And be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you guys so much for all the support we've been getting recently. And yeah, that's it.